In Chapter 12, we looked at the quantity theory of money. It's one of our tools that we might use to build up our understanding of macroeconomic theory. In Chapter 13, we're going to take some of the core insights of the quantity theory and build that out even more into our framework of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And this chapter and this framework is crucial to understanding how we can use macroeconomic theory to analyze economic policy. And as sort of the name suggests, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, there's a certain parallel here to supply and demand in microeconomics. They're not the same, but a certain kind of parallel that's useful and interesting. So what I want to do, at least in the video here, is to cover some of the key bits of Chapter 13. I want to talk about the derivation of the aggregate demand curve and how the aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply work together. And then we'll say a few things about shocks, and then we'll say a few things at the end about the Great Depression, and something I think actually is missing, importantly missing from the textbook's discussion of the Great Depression. So let me start by talking about about the aggregate demand curve. What the aggregate demand curve tries to do is to show us the various combinations of inflation, changes in the price level, and output growth, that is changes in GDP, that are consistent with a specific amount of spending. The easiest way to think about this is if we go back to our quantity theory framework, MV equals PY, right? What we're doing here is we're holding MV constant. We're saying for a given amount of total spending on the left side of that equation, what combinations of prices of inflation and changes in output are consistent with that growth rate in spending. So for example, if M times V is 5%, then we know that the other half of the equation, P times Y, also has to add up to 5%. So what combinations of changes in P and changes in Y are consistent with 5%? Well, for example, an inflation rate of 0 and an increase in GDP growth rate of 5% would be consistent with MV being growing at a 5% rate. But so would an inflation rate of 2% and GDP growth rate of 3%, or a GDP growth rate of 4% and an inflation rate of 1%. As long as those P and Y, the change in P and Y, add up to whatever the change in spending is, in this example 5%, then they're part of that aggregate demand curve. So one way to think about this, going back to earlier in the semester, what we're doing here is we're saying we're holding the amount of spending constant. We're locking that away in the box, and all we're varying here, right, is the inflation rate or the growth rate in GDP, either way you want to think about it. So what the aggregate demand curve traces out is that relationship between changes in P and changes in Y that are consistent with a certain amount of spending. And so what we end up getting, as the book shows, and the PowerPoint shows, is a downward sloping curve where if we put inflation on the vertical axis and changes in GDP on the horizontal axis, we get a downward sloping curve that shows essentially the trade-offs between inflation and growth rates as a result of holding that spending constant and seeing which combinations work. And if you have the PowerPoint in front of you, you can look at slide number 12, which illustrates this nicely and shows us that downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Notice, right, that what this implies is that the only things what can change the aggregate, can shift the aggregate demand curve, what gives us a new aggregate demand curve is a change in MV, right? That if we change the amount of spending, if we go to 6% or 7% spending, that aggregate demand curve begins to shift. If we increase the spending, it shifts to the right, outward. If we reduce that spending, it shifts left or inward. Again, just like a demand curve in microeconomics. So when we stop holding the stuff we're locking away in the box constant, the curve shifts. Again, just like our work with demand curves in general. So if spending goes up, right, that is, say perhaps, and we'll talk about in subsequent chapters, the central bank prints more money, or perhaps people's the velocity of money changes, people's demand for money changes, and they start spending more frequently the money that's in circulation. That is, they hold less of it. Their demand for money falls, velocity rises. That would also increase the rate of spending. That would also shift to a new aggregate demand curve. Okay, so that's the key to understanding aggregate demand, is that we construct it by holding MV, holding the spending side, changes in M, changes in V, holding the growth rate of spending constant, and then seeing what combinations of inflation and real GDP growth rate are consistent with that. So hopefully that helps explain more effectively what's happening with the book's description of how that aggregate demand curve is derived. Well, what about the aggregate supply curve? Well, it turns out we really have two kinds of aggregate supply curves to talk about. We have what we call the long-run aggregate supply curve, and then the short-run aggregate supply curve. The long-run aggregate supply curve is simply determined by the Solow rate of growth, right? The sort of things that we talked about in earlier chapters. So, for example, when we talk about long-run aggregate supply, we're simply talking about the real factors that affect the rate of growth, okay? It's the Solow growth rate. And again, if you have the PowerPoint open, you can look at slide 19, and that will show that to you, right? That there we see the vertical aggregate supply curve and sort of the economy's ability to grow. So what we can do is put together the downward sloping aggregate demand curve and the vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. Remember, that long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical if we are looking at inflation and growth rate and output on the two axes, right? Because the long-run aggregate supply curve is not affected by the inflation rate. That is, inflation in the long run doesn't affect growth rates. And in the Solow model, therefore, right, we have a vertical curve anchored at whatever that growth rate is. So we can put those two things together, right? And we can see where that sort of equilibrium is. Again, if you look at slide 24 in the PowerPoint, right, you can see where the economy is going to be. It will be in the long run anchored at the Solow growth rate. In the case of slide 24 here, 3%. And what the inflation rate will be determined by the location of the aggregate demand curve, that is the total level of spending. So in the example in slide 24, if the total rate of spending growth rate of spending is 10%, we know that the long run aggregate supply curve, the Solow growth rate is 3%, okay? Then therefore inflation has to be 7%. Okay? So we know that the inflation rate plus the long run growth rate in GDP have to add up to the growth rate in spending. And so that slide 24 nicely illustrates that point. So what happens here? How can any of this change? Well, certainly one of the ways that things can change here is what we call a real shock, right? If there is something that affects the long-run aggregate supply curve, say a positive shock to growth or a negative shock to growth, those are going to change those real growth rates. So, for example, if an increase in technology, an improvement in technology is a positive shock to growth, that long-run aggregate supply curve will move to the right. If you have the PowerPoint, slide 26 illustrates this nicely. We'll move from 3% to 7%. Given an aggregate demand curve, we know that means the inflation rate must fall, right, to 3%. And one way of thinking about that is the positive shock to growth means there's more goods. So we have the same amount of money chasing more goods. That is, we will not have the same increase in prices that we would otherwise, right? That the inflation rate will be lower. On the other hand, a negative shock, say like a natural disaster, right, might reduce the growth rate down, in this case, illustrated in the slide here, down to negative 1%. If that were the case, then the inflation rate would be 11%. What's the intuition here? The intuition here is a negative shock to growth reduces the amount of goods and services available, but you have the same number of dollars chasing it, right? So same spending happening. So same spending, fewer goods and services, that's going to push up the prices of those goods and services. That's why we would have, say, an 11% inflation rate in this example. So one of the things that can happen to economies are these real shocks, right? And there's a whole, in the textbook, there's a whole discussion of this, including a little table that shows all the different kinds of positive and negative shocks that can happen. But those are shifts in aggregate supply. What happens if we get a shift in aggregate demand? What happens if, again, we end up with an increase in the money supply, growth rate in the money supply, or change in the demand to hold money? In that case, we have to talk about what we call the short-run aggregate supply curve. And the idea here is that when spending changes, we do not get an immediate response from prices, okay? So, for example, when we're talking here, right, we're saying in the long run, right, prices and inflation and so on don't affect the real growth rate. But in the short run, they can. So, for example, suppose that we that the Federal Reserve increases the growth rate in the money supply, right? And so we see a greater growth rate in spending. what happens. In the short run, people can be fooled by this. In the short run, that increase in spending, right, that shift in the aggregate demand curve can lead people to think, right, that there's growth taking place when there's really not. So for example, if you have the PowerPoint, you can look at slide 41 here. An unexpected increase in the growth rate in the money supply can cause both inflation and the growth rate to increase in the short run. What happens here is people don't understand that the growth rate, the growth that seems to be taking place, the increased spending that's taking place, right, is simply a matter of an increase in the money supply. They're fooled, at least in the short run, into thinking this is real growth. In particular, one of the ways to understand this is that you can think about the growth rate in the money supply as being an expected growth rate in the money supply, right? That people expect, say, 3% per year growth rate in the money supply. If the monetary authority gives them 5% instead, that fools them, right? And for a brief period of time, it looks like there's more spending, it looks like there's more growth taking place, people will work more, there'll be greater output, but after a while what happens is prices will eventually rise, people will adjust their expectations to the new inflation rate, they will ask for higher wages. As they ask for higher wages, that will offset the growth in prices, and slowly what will happen is we will see the economy return back to the long run aggregate supply curve. If you look at, again, slide 41, you can see this happen. First, you can see the shift in aggregate demand, right? As the money supply growth rate increases, as the total amount of spending increases, we go from the first aggregate demand curve to the second one. In the short run, that takes us from a point like A to a point like B, right? If we went from 5% growth rate in spending to 10% growth rate in spending, we'd see both an increase in inflation, there from 2 to 4%, and an increase in the real GDP growth rate from 3 to 6%, again, in the short run. But as people's expectations shift, that short-run aggregate supply curve assumes that people are expecting a particular rate of inflation. When that expectation changes, because now they realize, hey, inflation is greater than it used to be, right? That short-run aggregate supply curve shifts. So in the short run, you can fool people, and you can get both an increase in growth and inflation. But once people catch on to what's happening, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts back or upward to the left, right? Shifts to the left, and eventually we get back to the long-run aggregate supply curve. In the long run, and again, you can, if you look over at slide 45, you can see this happen as inflationary expectations adjust, wages get unstuck, and we move back. So part of the key to this, right, is that wages don't catch up with wages don't adjust immediately to a change in spending. When spending changes happen, it takes time for people to adjust their wages. Wages are not perfectly flexible. Sticky is the word we use, but I think it's better to say imperfectly flexible. At least they lag behind changes in spending. And those changes in wages happen when people's expectations about the inflation rate change. So in the short run, again, looking at slide 45, you can move from A to B and fool people and get an increase in both inflation and real output in the short run. But over time, people's expectations adjust, the short run aggregate supply curve shifts, and we find ourselves back on the long run aggregate supply curve at a new higher rate of inflation, but back to the old long run growth rate. Again, in the long run, those increases in inflation and spending cannot affect the rate of growth. That's really important, right? That result is really important because it suggests that we can't spend our way into prosperity. That is, we can't, the Federal Reserve and Monetary Authority can't just start spending more dollars and generate long-run growth. Short-run, illusory growth, maybe, but not long-run growth. And at the end of the chapter, Cowen and Tabarrok apply this to the Great Depression, and they talk about the ways in which there were both real shocks in the Great Depression and major shocks to aggregate demand. In fact, one of the keys to the Great Depression is that the Federal Reserve allowed the money supply to drop by 30% over a several year period. That's a major reduction in aggregate demand, and you can visualize what would happen to output, even given the long run, even without a long run shock, right? We would see those real shocks. We would see those changes, but throw real shocks on top of it, you've got a big problem. The point I want to make here is a point they don't make, right? And one of the things we just said was that the reason why we get these short-run changes in output, either growth in output or decline in output if aggregate demand falls, like in the Great Depression, one of the reasons we get that is because wages don't adjust immediately. They're imperfectly flexible. Well, during the Great Depression, that was certainly true, but it was more true than usual because there were policies put into place and attempts by particularly the Hoover administration to persuade business people, especially big business big business people not to lower their wages in the face of the decline in prices in the money supply. And there was the reason for that was a theory that said that what really keeps the economy going is what Hoover and others called maintaining purchasing power. And if you cut people's wages, you cut their purchasing power, the argument was, and that would make matters worse. They were wrong about that, importantly wrong. In fact, exactly the opposite, right? When you have prices falling, right, because you see a decline in spending, you want wages to fall to adjust that. If you don't, real wages climb. And if real wages climb, labor gets more expensive, guess what we get? Unemployment. It's not coincidental that it was during the same period where the Hoover administration was trying and successfully preventing people from cutting nominal wages, that we saw unemployment skyrocket. Why did unemployment during the Great Depression go up to 20-25%? The answer is a combination of the decline in spending and the extra stickiness of wages that prevented them from adjusting in the face of that. That pushed up real wages, that pushed up unemployment. So as you read that last bit of the chapter, you might note that they don't talk about that sort of what we might call policy-induced stickiness of wages. But that was really important to understanding what was happening in the Great Depression. So, kind of brief summary of what this chapter says. We have these tools of aggregate demand and aggregate supply that can help us understand changes in policy, changes in things like spending, changes in effects of real shocks. The aggregate demand curve we construct by holding spending, MV, constant, and then looking at the combinations of inflation and growth rate and output that are consistent with that rate of spending. If we change the rate of spending, the aggregate demand curve shifts. On the aggregate supply side, our long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. It's not affected by changes in spending. That's the solo rate of growth we've talked about again in earlier chapters. However, in the short run, we can get effects on both inflation and real output at the same time, again, in the short run. So we do have this short-run aggregate supply curve that comes because wages don't adjust perfectly when spending adjusts. Right? Wages lag, they take some time to adjust, and in that time that they adjust, people can be fooled as their inflationary expectations are violated. We get movements along this short-run aggregate supply curve, but as their inflationary expectations catch up to reality, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts, and we get back to the long-run aggregate supply curve. So that's the core of Chapter 13. As you can see, my K9 teaching assistant is around today. And so hopefully that helps understand some of the core concepts at work here. We're going to take this as we look at the chapters on monetary and fiscal policy. We're going to take this framework and really apply it to understanding those changes in policy.